it is sort of a slippery slope is the first thing to say, but the other thing to say about that is that would indeed be a reason not to extend it to those other cases. All they would have to say is, look, we think women are particularly marginalised. 1 in 3 women will suffer sexual violence in her life. We think that's a pretty urgent and pressing problem that needs resolving now. And if there are other urgent and pressing problems, we're happy to have guaranteed representation for them too. The Parliament of Rwanda has guaranteed representation for women, youth, regions, religions, genocide survivors, and pensioners. Which does have the consequence that we do know who's going to win in advance. But there are what's called consociational parliaments that have guaranteed representation for all sorts of different minorities. Spain has a parliament which guarantees over-representation for all of its provinces. You might think that the Israeli electoral code is supposed to guarantee over-representation to minority interests. It appears not to, but you know, that's one of the reasons why you might adopt an electoral code like Israel's. I mean, there are very few reasons to adopt an electoral code like Israel's, but that's one of the arguments you might make. So I think that's a sentence. And I think the reductio ad absurdum thing is something they can fight off pretty easily. They could be like, 1, we're not defending that. 2, as you point out, that would be catastrophic. That would be a reason not to do it. And 3, we think women are an important issue here. And we don't think you can give us an infinitely long list of important issues. These are parallel. I'm going to return to that. These are related ideas, and this is a very second wave thought, which is to go, it is, well, there's a lot of women who feel patronised by feminism, or a lot of women who say that they feel patronised by feminism, have this thought in mind. And the idea is something like this. It is patriarchal to assume that you should set up a parliament so that women look after the women's stuff. And that men do not think about the women's stuff. Because, you know, babies. So the reason to get women into parliament is not because women are as good as men, but because women need to look after the babies. And it turns out that there are political issues to do with babies, and what flows from the uterus, and so on. I've just realised what I did there. So that would be a classically second wave response to go, this is itself the logic of what's been advanced over here in this representation argument is patriarchal. It is patriarchal because it assumes that men and women have fixed roles, and it is patriarchal because it assumes that women can only represent women on these issues. As you see how these are in essence the same point.
Yes, but you've just phrased it slightly, but what you basically said was, women can only represent women on these issues. And I think perhaps not a lot of people would agree with that so much as they would say that only women can represent women on these issues. So these are two different points in a way.
Right. And then, but the argument will be equally that you can still run the second, you'll have to make the second wave argument slightly better, but then all you say is, if what you've said is true in your first prop speech about how these issues affect women, presumably women can explain that to men. Right? Presumably, unless you think there is some necessary empathy gap between the genders, and that would also be patriarchal.
Interests?
Huh?
Yeah, interests.
A necessary one that men could not possibly understand. And the other thing you would say is, what you would need to add to that to actually find a harm, because right now this argument is just women going, oh, it's patronising. To turn that into a harm would be to point out that if you reserve women into reserve seats for women in Parliament, that is what you are saying those seats are for. You publicly say female MPs are there to look after the women's stuff, and you therefore mean that 1, men don't have to. So the efforts that you might have made to move beyond into a society where men could talk about women's issues and women could talk about men's issues are frustrated and are held back, because what you have done is you have publicly announced that the purpose of reserving seats for Parliament in women is to keep women in traditional roles. So you can make these people sound like outrageous misogynists. And you can see how there would be a clear harm there if you ran it that way. The problem with that statement is, again, it's kind of always true, unless you've got something else to say. Okay, so quite often, so are there other ways to deal with this, right? The idea that there might be another way to get to female emancipation. It's always going to be generically true that there exists other ways. You would have to further make the case, firstly, that you would have to make the case that your way is in some way superior, which is to say that it would work. Quite often in debates, people go, no, don't do affirmative action, we just need to educate people. I've heard that about 1 million times. Unless you can give me some reason to believe that your form of education is going to be better than all the other education that we've been trying for the past century, it's difficult to credit that. Right? It's difficult to see why this just educate people to not be misogynists is a workable option, unless you've got something very, very clever to say about how you could do that education differently. Have people heard the argument, don't do affirmative action, just educate people?
Or anything, don't do that, just
don't
educate.
Do that, just educate. It happens in debates all the time. To which the point of information is, how good are you at teaching? So, this may or may not be a good point, is my thought about that, right? That you would need to say an awful lot more to sell me on that, one way or the other. That will be an example of a second wave response to a sort of fairly standard rights-based argument coming from fundamental interest. But you could also have a choice-based conception of rights in prop. How would you do that, anyone?
Second wave.
You may or may not need to be second wave. Well, tell me a bit more about Israel. Why aren't women represented in politics in Israel? What are they doing instead? Are women trying to get into politics?
Nothing because of the Israeli army. No, I'm serious. Because what happens in Israel... No,
Say more, say more.
Because what happens in Israel, that many people who go to politics are coming from the army. You can see that with prime ministers, you can see that with people in the Knesset and whatever.
Okay.
And in the army, it's a place of men. So men promote men. Men are perceived as powerful or better or more smart,
Perfect.
and etc.
Absolutely perfect. So there are informal barriers.
Which is why it's a second wave argument, because you say the first wave of lack of formal barriers is not there.
So firstly, you make the argument, women do not in fact have the same choices to enter politics than men do, because, as Yarden says, they face barriers. What are those barriers? First one appeared to be military socialization. The second thing is to do with the party system. You can add voters. Voters don't want to vote for women. It's plausible to argue that at least some sections of Israeli society would not vote for a female politician. Yes?
Yes, the Orthodox.
Given that they encourage their wives not to read, I'm told. Should just be banned. Anyway. So the point of all these informal barriers to women participating is that they do not, in fact, have the same choices as men do. Now, if you think that political liberty is important, and you would have to make another argument that goes that it is crucial to a democratic state that we all have equal freedom to participate in political life, right? That's why choices to enter parliament, run for a political party, make a speech are important, because participating in the politics of society, the common driving of that society towards the future, is a core liberty. That's why we think these choices are important. If we can convince you that these barriers mean that women have less choices, it seems that the only way to give men and women equal choices is to reserve some seats. So this argument doesn't rely what makes the second wave as two things. Firstly, this argument doesn't rely on there being differences between men and women, in a way the previous argument did. The previous argument relied on there being differences in interests between men and women. This argument does not. And this argument is second wave insofar as it relies on informal barriers, to, things like the construction of female identity and all the rest of it. You could add to this role models, right? Women themselves do not enter politics because they feel it is in some way an unfeminine activity. Right? If you guarantee that there will be seats for women in parliament, that will change. And there are various examples of affirmative action dramatically altering expectations. The best example of that, I think, is the entry of black people into universities. Right now, entry of black people into universities in the 1970s through affirmative action doesn't massively raise the wealth of the black community in America in general, but it does create a black working class. It creates black figures of aspiration, so black people can see that they can become a lawyer, that as a lawyer is something they can think of aspiring to, that being a doctor is something that as a black person is open and available to them. And that again would be an informal barrier. So that's quite a second way of thinking about it on prop here, and it's connected to choices rather than to interests. This makes the argument better in two ways. Firstly, because you can't be characterized as misogynist as easily if you're doing it this way. And you don't have to rely on potentially dubious arguments about why men and women will always and necessarily have this gap and be different. Right? It is very difficult to defend the claim that there are innate, essential differences between men and women for all time. Right? It is very easy to muddy that water and to give enough reasons to believe that it might be socially constructed. So I prefer that argument because I think it opens you to less criticism. There are various ways of responding to this, though.
So
Do people care to advance them? Yes.
Well, this argument, as far as I can see, doesn't give any, by itself, it doesn't give any reason why the situation is bad. It's saying that the way things work make it likely that there will be fewer women in parliament. That's not saying that there's anything bad about there being fewer women in parliament. And take C, for example, voters prefer to vote in men. Yeah, so, what are you going to do about it? Why should we care that vote?
Would you be okay if businesses preferred to hire white people?
What?
If businesses preferred to hire white people, would that be okay for you?
If voters preferred to...
No, but if businesses preferred to hire white people, that would not be okay.
No.
But you are okay with voters saying we prefer to vote for men. Oh no, more than that, we are unwilling to vote for women.
Well, I didn't hear unwilling is in the explanation, but...
Well, all this stuff means that the character of Israeli politics is extremely masculine. If we are to accept Yarden's analysis, and in order for this conversation to happen, we assume Yarden true.
Yeah.
So to that extent, the political system itself prefers not to have women. Right? If the political system in Israel preferred not to have black people, would we think that was okay?
No.
Right. So why would it be acceptable for voters to prefer men to women? And then there is an argument here, right? I'm not bullying you. There is an argument here that there might be reasons why it's acceptable for voters to prefer men to women in a way it would not be acceptable for voters to prefer white people to black people. Say more.
Well, there is a reason that the politics in Israel are very military-based, because Israel is a military country for a good reason. It needs to be. So we need to be military-oriented. Males are more aggressive. They are more military.
You're not third wave anymore. You've just gone way back.
That's, that's a physiological fact.
Do we think that Golda Meir was less military than the other people in that cabinet? But was she less aggressive?
That means you don't know the rest of her cabinet.
I do know she was the only one with any balls. That was the quote, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The only one with any balls in that cabinet was Golda. I come from a country with Margaret Thatcher.
Average, of course. On the average. We're not
Generalization.
talking, yeah, we're not talking about
Yeah,
every
okay.
woman, we're talking about the average woman. So
Your argument being it is in fact better that Israel has a preponderance of male politicians.
yes, or if you're saying, if you were specific about voters, then this is a democracy. If someone has to vote.
Okay, so there are two different arguments there, right? One is that there are country-specific reasons why Israel should